Chapter 12. Haunted. Maggie stood, horrified and focused on the being in the doorway. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Her mother was dead. She knew she was dead. She had been the one to kill her. She stared in utter horror at the creature in the door and felt a full-bodied shiver rack her smaller form. The creature dragged its back limbs across the ground, slipping closer to Maggie. A crack, loud as thunder, split the air, and the creature shrieked. Sarah stood behind her desk, pistol raised and ready to fire another shot at the monster that was threatening her friends. "Maggie, move!" Maggie came back to herself and bolted. She didn't think. She couldn't. She couldn't breathe. She just had to get away. She ran and ran and ran until her legs and her lungs burned, and she kept running. When she finally hit her knees, she didn't know where she was, but she crawled herself into the smallest space she could, and she hid and she prayed and she tried to forget as she cried as silently as she could manage into her hands. She had abandoned everyone and hid because she was afraid, and as terrifying as the idea of the others dying because of her was, she couldn't bring herself to move from her hiding hole. She couldn't face her mother a second time. She wouldn't be able to kill her again. She had to hide, had to run, had to live. The creature launched itself at Sarah, who was knocked to the side by Terry tackling her down. The second shot buried itself in its shoulder, and it screeched in pain. It lashed out, clawing with long nails for whatever flesh it could rend. It caught Terry's side, leaving 4 deep, bleeding claw marks on him. He collapsed over Sarah, hissing in pain but refusing to stay down. He stood up as quickly as he could. Sarah leaned over him, hiking her skirt up to grab the moderately sized dagger from its holster on her thigh. "Terry, run. You can't do anything to help in your state, and I'm not letting you die. Go. I'll hold it off." Terry flinched, barely able to move out of the way when the creature charged again. Sarah yanked up the metal tray Maggie had dropped and held it in one hand, her dagger in the other like an impromptu sword and shield. Terry wanted to help, but before he could, Martin grabbed him by the shoulder and pulled him away. "Go on. I'll help Sarah." Terry quickly handed over the letter opener to Martin and took off, booking it in the direction Maggie had run in hopes of finding her and getting her help. Sarah dodged the long claws of the monster again, and it shouted its fury before turning, noticing Terry running. It tried to follow him, but Martin quickly moved into its path. "You're not getting to them," he growled. Martin never considered himself a brave man, but he had bonded with those children and had lost too many friends over the years. He would not lose anyone else. He had sent Trevor and Julia away, and he would do the same thing now. He stood, eyes glowing as static filled the air and his hair began to rise slightly. "Leave the Martin didn't get to finish his words, as the creature lashed out and gripped him by his throat, squeezing so hard Martin saw stars dancing in front of his eyes. She moved her face closer to him, unhinging her jaw as she opened her mouth wide, teeth sharp like a shark. Martin just knew she was ready to bite his head off when she screamed and dropped him. He laid on the ground, coming down from nearly having his neck broken. Sarah dragged her blade down the monster's leg, gripping onto her from behind and keeping out of her reach. She held on tight as the monster spun in circles, trying to get the girl and the knife off her backside. Sarah dragged the serrated knife out and stabbed it into the monster's other leg. The monster howled and finally reached Sarah, knocking her back with enough force to send her flying across the room. She hit the wall with a loud crunch, and Martin felt fear run through him. The monster screamed and took off the direction Terry and Maggie had gone, leaving the other 2 behind on the floor in the archives. Martin crawled his way over to Sarah and gently scooped her into his arms. He pulled out his phone and called an ambulance. There was blood, too much of it, and he was scared she wouldn't make it. She had fallen unconscious on the floor. He knew he should stay with Sarah, but she wasn't going anywhere, and the other 2 assistants were in immediate danger. Martin had to make a decision, and he chose the ones who needed him more. He gently laid her down on the floor and got up, limping after the monster that had left a blood trail behind it. He only hoped he would get there in time. Terry found himself wandering around in artifact storage. There was a small trail of blood left behind from the wound in his side, and it simply proved what he already knew. Hiding wouldn't help him. He needed to find something to stem the blood flow or he would bleed out before help arrived. He took off his jacket and tied it around his side tightly, barely holding off the loud yelp of pain that wanted to escape his throat. Suddenly he stopped. He could hear something. Someone speaking from a distance. It had to be Maggie. She must have hidden in here like he did. He quickly took off that direction as fast as he could, limping his way through the large hall full of different items on tall shelves. He went towards the voice, and as he got closer, he realized it wasn't talking. It was singing. The song sounded so sad and sweet it drew him like a moth to fire. Everything faded away. The monster, the pain burning in his side, the fear and adrenaline. All that was left was a beautiful singing voice calling to him. He followed the voice through the hall and to another room. The door opened for him and he stepped inside. There, in the corner of the room, was a coffin. Its lid was shut and there were chains covering it, but the song came from inside. No, not a song. The coffin was moaning. Terry knew he needed to open it. He had to get it open. Had to go inside. Inside? Why did he need to go inside? Why was he opening it? He couldn't understand it, but that didn't stop him. The moment he touched the padlock, it clicked open, unlocking itself. He removed the lock and the chain fell from around the coffin. He opened the lid and stared into the darkness. His eyes glazed over, and he felt his legs moving, one step after another, descending until something grabbed his arm and dragged him back. "Terry! Terry, stop! You can't go in there!" Someone was calling to him. Someone was pulling on him. He blinked, vision clearing. Maggie had one hand on the lid of the coffin that was trying to close, and the other hand was gripping his arm, stopping him just barely from taking another step. He looked down the stairs into the darkness, swallowing hard, and quickly bolted back up the stairs, nearly tackling Maggie on the way out. The lid shut angrily, and Maggie and Terry sat on the ground, breathing hard in palpable panic. He had almost walked willingly into the open jaws of a monster. Suddenly he remembered. Monsters. Maggie had been shouting. They needed to leave before that thing found them. Margaret. Too late. Its long claws gripped around the door frame, pulling its head into the door upside down with a smile on its face. "I found you, dear," it chimed happily. It began to drag itself into the room, limbs shifting and cracking out of place to fit through the doorway. It was getting bigger, feeding on their fear. Its wounds had already begun to heal, a telling sign that there was no way to kill this creature via injuries. At least, none that weren't inherently fatal. Maggie backed herself to the wall as it came in. She shook her head and covered her ears, whispering, "Please no," under her breath, repeating the words like a prayer that would keep her safe. "Don't worry, darling. I just want us to be together. It won't hurt much. Don't you want that too? Don't you want to be with your mother?" Maggie curled herself into a small ball, hiding her face in her knees. Then a shadow was over her. She lifted her head, finding Terry standing between her and the monster. "Leave her alone!" he cried, arms out, protecting his friend. He was scared. His side ached and his knees could barely keep him up through their shaking, but he tried his best. The creature's smile fell, replaced by a horrifying snarl of teeth and sharp edges. Its eyes glowed an angry red. It moved to attack, only to be stopped when Martin grabbed its back leg, keeping her from moving. "Run!" he called out to them, eyes wide with fear. Maggie sat still, horrified as Terry looked around for anything to use as a weapon. His eyes stopped on the coffin. He knelt down beside Maggie. "I need you to listen to me. Focus, Maggie. I need you to be strong. Can you do that? Come stand over here, and when I shout, get out of the way. Understand?" She stared at him, the words sinking in. She stood up with his help and moved to put herself in front of the coffin. Terry quickly rushed over, prying at the lid, forcing it open. "Martin!" Martin lifted his head from where the beast was pounding her fist onto his back, leaving behind bruises and breaking ribs. His back cracked painfully. He saw the open coffin and nodded. He looked at Maggie, waiting for her to make eye contact before he released the monster. The beast took off toward her as soon as it was let go. Maggie felt fear driving into her core as the monster charged toward her. What was she supposed to do? "Now!" Terry shouted. Maggie's feet were glued to the floor. The monster stopped, looming over her, claws and teeth at the ready to devour her. "Maggie!" 2 gunshots went off, slamming into the monster's back as Sarah burst into the room, past Martin, and tossed her gun aside to grab Maggie and drag her out of the way. They both slammed into the wall, and Martin took a running start to slam himself into the monster's back. Terry held the coffin open, and as soon as it was inside, he started trying to slam the door on it. It took both Martin and Terry together to force the door shut on the screaming creature. But finally, the monster was silent, drowned out by the moans of the coffin, then blissful silence as it was satisfied with its latest meal. Finally, the archives was quiet. The monster with Maggie's mother's face was gone, trapped in the buried. Sarah sat up slowly, holding her arm as blood dripped down the side of her face from her head injury. Her pistol was across the room, emptied of her spare bullets. She was officially out of ammo and weapons, but luckily she wouldn't need them now. Maggie quickly turned to her side. "Are you crazy? You could have been killed!" she shouted, anger outweighing the fear that had swallowed her moments before. "If I didn't get in the way, you would be in there with that thing. I believe I'm owed a thank you." "I'm not going to thank you for nearly getting yourself killed in my stead. Your life is worth more than mine. No one's life is worth more or less than anyone else," Terry shouted, halting the argument. "Stop fighting and get up. We're getting the hell out of here." Maggie opened her mouth to protest before stopping. "Now," Terry added for emphasis. Maggie reached out and put Sarah's good arm over her shoulder, helping her stand. Martin, meanwhile, both held and leaned on Terry. Together, the 4 headed back down the halls into the archives and then up into the main building. They collapsed together in the floor of the main hall, staring at one another before a laugh bubbled from Martin. It spread like wildfire until all 4 were grinning like idiots, arms wrapped around each other, each glad the other 3 were still alive. Martin decided then that he would do anything to protect these kids who were thrown into the fire without knowing what would happen to them. Laughter turned to tears as Maggie leaned on Sarah and Terry and sobbed brokenly. They held her and let her fall apart as Martin explained to the officials what happened. The group was taken to the hospital in an ambulance and treated. Terry and Sarah shared a room in the hospital. Both would need to be kept for a couple days to assess the damage and heal, especially for Sarah, who had a nasty concussion. Maggie had been altogether spared injury, and Martin was left with nasty bruises but no open wounds. He would need some time off to heal his broken ribs and a chiropractor for his back, but he wouldn't have to stay in the hospital. The door was thrown open, and 2 well-dressed men, one in a suit and the other in slacks and a turtleneck sweater, blew into the room with the force of a hurricane. They rushed to Sarah's bedside and quickly wrapped her in hugs and inquiries about her health. For all her cold aloofness, she warmed considerably at seeing them. It was clear how much she loved her parents. When offered a better hospital, she asked to stay with her friends. Dominique and Schuyler introduced themselves to Martin, who greeted them in return and apologized for having let anything happen to their child. It didn't take long to explain what kind of place the archives was and the sort of thing that happened there. "How many people in her position have died there?" "2. They started down there when I did. One was replaced by the same type of monster we face today, and the other blew himself up to stop a ritual." Schuyler looked worried, sending a fretful glance at Sarah, who simply responded with a thumbs up with the arm not in a cast and a sling. It didn't take long after that for John to arrive with Georgie. He tapped his cane on the floor, casting his head about in worry. "Is this the right room? Is he here? Martin?" John whimpered hopefully, head turning side to side as if he could look around the room. "I'm here, John. I'm all right, love." Martin stood up with a grunt of pain and hobbled over to where John was. He quickly cupped his cheeks and kissed him softly, glad he had lived through this to see him again. John dropped his cane and threw his arms around him, clinging tightly. Martin felt the air crushed from him and whimpered, "Ow, ow, 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 John, ribs, ribs!" John released him immediately with a sheepish look. "Sorry, what happened to your ribs?" "Section 31 happened." John's face said it all. Big oof. Martin sighed. "I'm certainly marked by the stranger now. Yippee!" John took his hand and held it in both of his. "We'll figure it out, Martin. I'm sure of it. For now, let's sit down. I want to be closer to you." Martin felt his cheeks flush at Maggie's finger guns and Terry's whistle of approval. Sarah simply gave another thumbs up, but her expression spoke clearly enough she needed words to say, "Get it, boss." Martin knew at that moment those kids would be the death of him.